Hi everyone, my name's Leigh Harris and this is McLean, and we're going to deliver two talks back to back that are both short, sharp lessons that we think will help you up your game in game development. We're going to start with my talk, and I'm going to start by taking you to ancient Greece, or what would now be modern day Turkey, but largely considered ancient Greece. This is Heraclitus, or an artist's interpretation of Heraclitus from somewhere in the Renaissance. He's a pre-Socratic philosopher, so just before Socrates. And what he was trying to convince the world of was that everything is constantly in a state of flux, that everything is always moving, always changing. And this is an idea that has been pervasive throughout philosophy all the way up to the modern day, with people who do philosophy constantly referring to things as being in a state of becoming. And he was having a lot of difficulty trying to describe what he meant when he was saying this. So he illustrated it using an example. He said, you can't step into the same river twice. What he was trying to illustrate was that the flow and the movement of the river was such that when you trod in it a second time, you were treading into a completely different set of water particles and molecules. And he was trying to illustrate through this small example what he meant about the everyday world, about the movement of everything, the air that's flowing around you, the way trees are growing and animals are dying and giving birth. Everything was in a constant state of flux. That his concept was so abstract that he found it difficult to convince people of what he was saying. The river example was his way of trying to bring people on board, and we're still talking about it to this day, so I guess it worked. So what am I talking about? Who's this talk for? I tried to figure out who the audience was a couple of times, and eventually I got to the point of going, look, anyone who's trying to communicate an abstract or a non-existent thing to somebody else as part of their everyday life is going to find this talk useful, whether you're a philosopher from ancient Greece or a game designer with a really specific outcome in mind. For those of you who don't know, my background is in game design. I've been a lead game designer on several indie games, and am now a senior game designer and team head at Wargaming Sydney. So I play in this space a whole lot, and I'm going to try and teach you what some of my game design approaches to this sort of thing mean when used in other contexts. For starters, I'm going to go back to 2014 when I was doing studio PR and marketing for a game called Majestic Knights. And it was an interesting one because for quite some time during development, we were describing it the way that it had been described to me by the developers, which is as an action RPG with a bunch of other elements in it. And we started getting feedback from displeased players saying that they didn't think it was an RPG at all. So I threw to my social media contacts and went, hey, everyone, when I say RPG, what do you think I'm talking about? What does a game have that makes it an RPG? And I know we've got the distinction between, the old school, what is a role-playing game, Dungeons and Dragons, versus what does it mean in a video game mentality, but this was different. This was specifically, what sets of mechanics are you looking for? And the thing that this game was lacking, even though it had a lot of the trappings of what you might consider an RPG, you had branching dialogue options, non-linear levels, and the ability to explore. But the thing that was missing was that you couldn't actually upgrade your character on different trees. You didn't have stat increases or management. And that was a common thread that a lot of people considered crucial to an RPG that we somehow missed. So the reason why I think this talk is important is because small miscommunications about single terms can often have really big ramifications. We caught this one in time, but if we hadn't, we would have got a lot of customers buying a game that wasn't quite what they were expecting. And that would have been a big problem for the studio. So as a game designer, you're constantly making things that don't exist yet. You're trying to conceive of things that aren't real and make them real. And often you have to rely on other people to manifest those things. You have to be able to describe this non-real thing to somebody else who's doing some of the implementation. You might be doing it yourself, but as a game designer, I find there's a lot of communication going on. You're also trying to articulate abstract things. When you're talking about gameplay and you say, oh, we're trying to go for this sort of gameplay, you're describing a human experience. That's pretty abstract. You're also trying to get abstract things from other people and turn them into something tangible. You're trying to read people's feelings about your game and sniff out what it is they're saying. What are they trying to get you to change about the game that's going to improve their experience? What is their experience? So what I'm going to try and get you to do is think of every instance where you're communicating with somebody, regardless of whether you're in game design or not, And I want you to think of any ambiguous word as a problem space in disguise. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. This was the last game that I released. It was called Objects in Space. On the right-hand side, you can see a screenshot from being on a space station. And if you click on that screen on the wall, then it looks something like this on the left. It's a market screen. You buy and you sell goods or spaceship parts. You fly around in your spaceship to star systems all throughout a massive cluster, heaps of planets and places and things to go visit. And what we needed to do, the challenge for us was, how do we make an economy that's going to work? We didn't want to manually set the prices at every single space station for every single ship part and every type of good that you could buy or sell. That would take ages. So we needed to create a system or an algorithm that was going to work for us. So what we ended up doing was trying out an algorithm and getting something that we thought might work, and then telling it, right, this is the base value of 1 unit of a particular good. And we want you to add a modifier based on your location. If you're at this space station, increase the value by this much or decrease by this much. We did that and then put a couple of goods through the algorithm to see if it spat out numbers that made sense to us. And then we tried to figure out why, if it didn't, we could change it, so that we could change it. So this is sort of what that looked like. At the top, we've got the base value of a particular good. Let's say it's a space muffler. Whatever that is. It just sounded funny, so I put it in the talk. You got the base value of a space muffler as $8, and then you multiply that by its proximity to the place that that space muffler gets created narratively. So in the world, if it's built at a neighboring star system, it might be a lot cheaper where you are than if it was built really far away. And then you add a markup for retail, because I think that's a good constant to have. And what we got was, at planet A, it was $20. At planet B, it was 45. But planet C spat out a really unrealistic 700. We're like, whoa, okay, that's very different. Fast forward about 16 different iterations on this algorithm, and you go from that really simple test number 1 to test number 17. I'm making that up. I don't know exactly how many tests we did, but it was the base value multiplied by how close you are to the part's point of origin, multiplied by the general level of wealth of that star system as defined by the narrative, multiplied by the dominant financial sector. Is it a mining place, a leisure place? Is it a commercial hub? Multiplied by its location relative to the central systems, because the central systems tend to have more goods coming in, so they become cheaper. And then we add the markup, and we started to get something that was a little bit more in line with what we'd expect to see. And so that was our sort of trial and error process. And it really stuck with me, because this exact method I tend to use a lot when just talking to people in my everyday communications. Not multiplying things in my head, that would definitely not go over well with people and would make me appear robotic. What I'm doing is trying to figure out how I can understand what people are saying by poking and testing holes in the things that I don't quite understand. So I mentioned a problem space earlier. This is something we use in design all the time. What we mean when we say a problem space is a general part of a game in which a problem exists. A general part meaning it has fuzzy boundaries, and maybe those boundaries are interlinked with other things. It's a set of mechanics that kind of comprise a system. And this is sounding a little bit difficult to describe, so it's probably good for me to use a visual aid. On the left, what I've tried to draw here is a poorly defined problem space. It's got fuzzy boundaries. We're not quite sure what is part of the problem and what isn't part of the problem. Maybe the problem that we're looking at is actually caused by another issue. Maybe they are semi-related. Maybe other characters are the cause of our character's issue. What constitutes too fast or too slow as defined by this problem space? Is this a mechanics problem? Is it to do with communication? And on the right of the screen, what I've got is a well-defined problem space where all of these little phrases are clearly on the outside of our bounding box. We fully understand what is and isn't a part of this problem. And this is the sort of way that I tend to conceive of a lot of things when I'm thinking about the problems we're facing in design. And what I'd like you to do is take this general way of thinking and put it into human communication more generally. So this mess of words on the right of the screen, I know it's a lot, but bear with me. This is a word map of different connotations from Stanford University of light. So when someone says light, what might they mean? Might they mean the feeling of lightness, industrial lightness, like something you might get in a cityscape? Do they mean different colors or weather? Light can mean different things to do with morning or fogginess or dim. Or are they talking about the visible light spectrum? There's a whole different number of ways that you could interpret light. So what I want to suggest is that you take something like this light word map, you recognize, hold on, light, that's an ambiguous term. We have a problem space. Let's think of it as a problem space. So if we were to move light into our poorly defined problem space, we might get something like this. So, oh, someone has just said light, and you need to clock that. You need to think of that as a trigger for you to start going, hold on, ambiguity was said, let's seek some clarity. So when this person has said light, do they mean electric light? Do they mean brightness, industrial light, the feeling of lightness? And how can we find out? Well, there's a couple of ways. We can just ask them, but before that, and probably the reason why some people might not see too much value in this, context often gives you huge numbers of clues. So for example, in my line of work, I'm often working with vehicles. So let's say somebody says that a vehicle is a bit too light. What might they mean by that? I can already rule out massive chunks of meanings of the word light. I know that most of these are definitely not quite what I'm talking about. And it still leaves me with only a couple on the left. But when you think about those couple, you can see that this graph on the right breaks it down even further. So with it being able to be broken down so much, I need to figure out exactly what someone means so I don't misinterpret them, make a change they're not expecting, waste everyone's time and resources, and slow down development. So how do I ask somebody what they mean? Well, so let's say when someone's saying that they think something is light, or they're using the term light to describe a vehicle. Here are a bunch of things that I specifically think they might mean. Maybe if a vehicle is light, it stops really quickly, or maybe it accelerates really quickly, it turns quickly, it is lithe or nimble, it's literally not that heavy, like we change the weight of the vehicle in the game. Or maybe when they say light, they are specifically talking about being floaty and floating up in the air, so they're talking about how long it takes to fall. Any of those could be true. So what my task is when someone uses an ambiguous term is to try and jump in and go, what do you mean by that? And this is the part where I'm going to ask you to pay close attention. This is the slide that really matters. Of all of the others, if you forget them, just remember this. As soon as someone uses an ambiguous term in a conversation, and this could be a stakeholder who is requesting something of you, it could be a client you're trying to deliver a game to, it could be anything. But someone communicates to you something they need changed, and that thing that you're changing is going to be tangible using variables in the game. You need to clock that an ambiguous term has been said and say, hold on, I know what I think that means. From context, I can rule out half a dozen things I think it's not, but how do I know for sure that I'm interpreting them correctly? So the thing that I'd like you to try and remember is when you say light, do you mean X? When you say light, do you mean it stops on a dime? When you say light, do you mean it turns really quickly? Another way of saying it, which is also pretty good, is when you say light, what I hear is X. It's not asking a direct question, so it's still not maybe perfect, but it's still good to be able to say, just so that you know, when you say light, I assume you're talking about acceleration. If you give a really specific example, then that gives them an opportunity to go, whoa, no, that's not at all what I meant. We're on different pages. And then they'll give a counterexample that will explain what they do mean, that you've kicked off that conversation. And the really bad way to take it when someone says, I would like it to be light, is to go, cool, I will make it lighter. I completely understand. Got it. That's where you're going to barrel towards a misunderstanding that leads to wasted dev time. So what you want to do is try and make it a little less fuzzy. So in this example, a better defined problem space when someone says, I need this thing to be light, might be to go, okay, cool. What do you mean by that? And they might go, oh, well, at the moment, I feel like when I turn, it's a little bit heavy, or I can't seem to control it too much when it's moving quickly. And you might be able to rule out a couple and keep them on the outside. Like the feeling of weightlessness while airborne doesn't really play into that description. And neither does it being not as heavy mechanically. But you can identify a few that are within the problem space, move them to the inside of your little hypothetical bounding box and go, cool. When they say they want it lighter, they are referring to these things and not these things. So recently, Dr. Celia Hoden, who's a consulting psychologist on video games, was talking on the Bush League Gaming podcast about some of the problems that are facing the industry at the moment. Specifically, she was talking about dark patterns of design and trying to articulate for the audience what a dark pattern of design meant. And that's a tricky one because she was dealing with an abstract concept and trying to make it really clear for people. So we're talking about dark patterns of design, and her and the hosts were talking about different things that they might consider a dark pattern. So manipulating someone into buying something when they didn't actually intend to buy it, making them feel bad as a result of having made a purchase instead of good, exploiting someone's likelihood to buy something when they're not necessarily doing it proactively and they feel as though they were manipulated. And she was very quick to say, what I don't mean by that is just loot boxes. And loot boxes are a great example of a gray area. There's something that could be inside or outside the problem space of what is a dark pattern. So a loot box can be very manipulative, absolutely. It can also be something totally benign, which is just a fun part of gameplay. Giving people randomness and the ability to roll the dice on something is a key tool for game designers. We don't necessarily want to lose that. And Dr. Hoden knows that from having spent a lot of time trying to explain dark patterns to people and having people go, okay, cool, so loot boxes. And she's had to go, no, I do not mean loot boxes. My point being that illustrating via an example of what something is not is just as important as illustrating via an example of what something is. So with the one thing I didn't really mention before, acceleration, the reason you might want to rule that out is because if you ask the question, hey, when you say light, what do you mean? And someone says, oh, I'm referring specifically to when you're turning, it feels kind of heavy, or I can't stop when I want to. If you were to say, do you mean it's related to how quickly it gets up to speed or its acceleration? And someone were to say, oh, no, I don't mean that at all. Then you can cross it off by having raised a counterexample. And we use these kinds of things in other areas too. For example, user personas. Everyone hopefully would be familiar with a user persona. You put a couple of facts up there about a person who you're trying to target with your game, like this Leigh Harkness character on the left here. So you've got a bunch of things that Leigh Harkness likes or doesn't like, and you know roughly why they play games, what sorts of habits they're in, what they're looking for from a gaming experience, and that's good. But what you might also do, and I think not everybody does this, but I think it's relatively common, is to put up an anti-persona. When I say that this game is targeting Leigh Harkness, this person over here, I am saying X, Y, and Z. This person likes these things, so we should lean into them. But also, we know that if someone like Leigh Paris on the right here, who likes a very different set of things, if Leigh Paris were to get their hands on our game, they'd probably not like it as much because they're into different things. If we accidentally communicate that this is the sort of game Leigh Paris would like, and they pick it up, then we might get a negative review. We want to be careful to target not just through the game itself and its mechanics, but also the marketing and presentation of the game, who it is we're after and who it is we're not, so that the people who we don't think would like this game don't pick it up, so that we get more positive reviews and a clearer target audience. So I want to use another example here of children. Children have to learn words, and they learn a lot very, very quickly. They are sponges for this stuff. And what they tend to do is learn very quickly, not based on what you'd think. A lot of people might assume that when kids learn a new word, it's because they've heard it a certain number of times. And that's not true. If you hear the same word in the same context 50 times over, you're only going to learn one application of that word. You're going to think it has a very specific meaning. Let's say, for example, because we're in lockdown and I've been in my apartment for months on end, let's say I'm referring to the fridge as nice in front of a small child who's just learning words. And I constantly use the word nice, but only ever to describe the fridge. Are they going to understand what the word nice means, or are they just going to think nice is a quality of some kind that that fridge possesses? And maybe Leigh feels positively about that quality. The way that a child will learn the word nice is if you hear the word nice applied to different things in different contexts for different reasons. And often there's a bit of overlap there. If you hear a word a large number of times, chances are you're going to hear it in a lot of different contexts. But we're going further than that and saying it's the context that matters more than the repetition. So with that in mind, I want you to think for a second about playtest feedback. So as a designer, you're probably getting a lot of people saying that something is one thing. They're saying it's hard to control, or they're saying it's, too one thing or another. It's too spongy, too floaty. You get a lot of very, very ambiguous terms from people, and it's difficult to know what they mean. As opposed to the stakeholder or client example, where you can say, yeah, I know what that person means because I had a chance to interrogate them afterwards and say, what do you mean by X? If you're going over reams and reams of feedback from people and you're trying to figure out what on earth is wrong with your game, it's difficult when you get that ambiguous phrase. So a good way of trying to figure out what people mean by that phrase without having access to them is to take a look at some of the more tangible examples of, I had this experience and I didn't like it, and see which ones link to the phrase. So in this example, I couldn't turn when I wanted to. That relates to it being hard to control. I kept crashing into things. If your vehicle's hard to control, that might happen a lot. It doesn't steer fast enough. That feels like hard to control. I kept dying, probably not so related. And the one in the middle, which I threw in as a gray area, I didn't understand which buttons did what, very, very directly correlates to it being hard to control. But that's kind of in there as a bit of a gotcha. Because what I'm trying to say there is that I didn't link those two because if I don't know what the buttons do, it's not that it's hard to control, it's that it's hard to understand how to control it. But the other three, not being able to turn, crashing into things, not steering fast enough, those are all things which kind of articulate the same thing. So if you start to look at concrete examples of specific bits in gameplay and relate them back to the abstract term, you'll have a better time understanding what the abstract term means. So to summarize, what have we done here? We've identified an abstract concept. So think about ambiguity or abstractness, non-existence, anything that's hard to define, and think of it as a designer would as a problem space. And then what we've done is illustrated how that works through examples. I started with Heraclitus and his river in ancient Greece/Turkey, depending on where you want to think of him. I've talked about Majestic Knights and the genre identity problem that it had, objects in space, and us using an algorithm and trying to figure out whether or not the algorithm was saying the thing we wanted it to say. I've looked at light and the way that it can give you a bunch of different meanings based on where you're hearing it in context. Dr. Celia Hoden in the Bush League Gaming podcast and her use of a counterexample to help illustrate what she was saying rather than what she wasn't. I've talked about children and how they learn new words by hearing multiple contexts at once. And I've tried to describe how you can use those sorts of tactics to help you understand ambiguous feedback when it comes to you in playtests. But at the end of the day, the only important thing that I really want you to take away from this, because I often have talks with 50 different points, the one thing I want you to be taking away is this phrase. When you say X, do you mean Y? If you can get yourself into the habit of saying that whenever you clock someone using an ambiguous term that requires a tangible response, you will find that your communication improves, you'll get more clarity, and it'll help you make a better game. We'll now leave time for questions.
Okay, all right. Welcome to the second half of our talk, The Little Things. So I'm Leigh McLean. I am a senior producer at Mighty Kingdom. Previously, I have experience as a product manager, product director, and game runner across kind of a whole range of projects through AAA, indie, serious games on all sorts of platforms. So the long and short of it is that I'm always just messing around with how to make games with people, basically. So what I'm going to focus on today for this short talk is how to make a risk roadmap. So if you don't know what a risk roadmap is, it's really just a visual way to have a conversation that leverages the expertise of the people on your team. So there's a lot of people on your team with lots of different insights and experiences and assumptions they're making about the project that you're working on. So you really just want to wring out all that brain juice and get it on the page. And a risk roadmap is also something that should evolve as you go. So even though we're just going to make one today, if you are adopting this practice into your project, you should really think about it as something that you're always coming back to, always updating, always reviewing. What it isn't is it's not a schedule for development. So it's going to be tempting when you put the work that needs to be done and the time that you think you have to make it alongside each other to think, well, this is our plan. So shy away, resist the temptation to turn this into your development schedule. The reason that a risk roadmap is a really effective tool in my mind is because you can do it really quickly without having to fuss around too much with the details of scheduling work. It also isn't a producer-only thing, so you don't need any special training or special expensive software to do this. Today, we're just going to do it using Post-it notes on a whiteboard. And so I'm hoping what you take away from this is that really anybody on the project who cares about where the project is going and who wants to communicate with the people around them could theoretically, make a risk roadmap. So you're going to need 4 pieces of key information to build your roadmap, and that is the work you think you have to do, the way the team feels about that work, the time you think you have to do it in, and any other constraints around your project. And constraints might be a little bit different depending on the type of project and the type of team. For today, we're going to focus on really simple things in our example. So the time that we have and the number of people we can have on the team, but depending on your development environment, you could get really complex with this, or you could keep it really simple. It's really up to you. And our goal in creating this roadmap is to visualize this information in a way that stimulates meaningful conversation. So let's have a crack at it. We're going to make a risk roadmap today, right now, for one of my games that I'm working on in my own time, the Capybara Long Bath Challenge. And this is a game that is all about having a cast of capybaras and having to keep them in baths for as long as possible by appealing to their personal preferences. So for example, this is a capybara who particularly likes the correct number of lemons in his bath. This is a game that's absolutely never going to come out. So it's a very useful game to use as a hypothetical scenario. And I'm going to try and keep things really, really simple, really, really high level for today, because I really want as many people as possible to imagine how they might use something like this in their project. So when we talked about what you need to build your risk roadmap, I'm going to show you in a little bit more detail how you could gather that information. So this is my backlog risk assessment section of my board. So I mentioned that you need to list the work you think you have to do. So I've done that here in the form of some epics, which are just high-level chunks of work that need to be done. I've got 5 of them, and I've ranked them on this board in terms of priority. So you can see up here my phase goal right now is to get a representative build onto the App Store to start doing user acquisition testing. So with that goal in mind, my App Store submission preparation epic is my #1 priority. And then you can see I've got some work on bath systems, I've got some work on characters, I've got some work on levels, and then I've got an additional game mode, which is my lowest priority. So I've defined what those epics are and the work that has to go into those epics, and I've ranked them in terms of their priority to the phase that we're currently working towards. Now, the next piece of work that we need to do is looking at the way the team feels about the work. And all of this stuff is the way the team feels about the work. And that's why you can have 1 column for something as simple as what do we need to do, and 3 columns and as much conversation as possible about how we feel about that work. So I've done that through 3 lenses today. First is t-shirt sizing. So t-shirt sizing is, a really quick sizing exercise. If you've never done it before, it's just looking at a piece of work that you've already done. So for example, I might be thinking about the core loop work for the game. And maybe that took us about a month and a half. And it was, relatively known work. We understood what was involved in that. So then taking that and say, okay, that's a medium. Then that might be, if I compare that work to like creating the levels that we need to make for soft launch, the team might say, okay, well, that's kind of the same amount of work. We think that the same amount of risk in there, it's the same amount of time investment. So, okay, that's a medium. But then creating all of our characters for our soft launch, well, that's more work than the bath levels. It's more work than the core loop, but it's not as scary to us as the App Store submission. So, okay, that's a large. And you can see how this kind of relative sizing can sort of flesh out how you feel about your whole backlog. And similar to sort of if you're using story points or another estimation method like that, you want to include not just the time something might take, but also the risk or the unknowns involved in it. So for App Store submission, my team, we've never done this before. So even though the amount of work that goes into it might be a large or even just a medium, we're bumping it up to an extra large because it feels more risky to us. So talking about risks, writing down your risks is all about capturing how your team feels. So do they seem hesitant about something? Does the work seem vague? Are they always kind of nervous when you bring it up or have that conversation? Are they hesitant to have that conversation? Ask why, dig into it, and document these things. There are risks different to development risks and risks that are different to unknowns, but when it comes to the day-to-day of managing your development, these risks are also really important to document. So I've written them down here. And then lastly, we've looked at the severity. So in this context, severity of risk is about probability and impact. So to make it really, really simple for today, we could do a whole 2-hour talk about severity risk assessment. Let's go for a 1 to 5 rating. So 5 is really high risk, really high probability. 1 is really low probability, really low impact. So you can see that the App Store submission being something we've never done before and being really central to this phase, we've made it a severity 5. The weekly challenge game mode, the risk here is just that we need time to iterate on it, and it's something that's kind of unproven and it has some dependencies, but it's also our lowest priority piece of work. So we're going to put that as a 1. Okay, so let's get into just start building our roadmap. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my prioritized work. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to put this down the left-hand side of my roadmap. So that's going to create these streams of work. The next thing I'm going to do is look at my time constraints. So over here, I've looked at the time that I think I have to do this work in. I've got 6 months to be live on the store to start testing user acquisition. So ahead of time, I just made these little month blocks that I can drag over. Put them along the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Okay, starting from this month. All right, now we're going to look at our t-shirt sizes. So I've got a bit of a scale here, so I can see, I'll just remove my little bit of scribble. I can see that large is around 3 months, and this is an extra large, so that's going to be larger than 3 months. So if I drag my block out, let's say 4 months, sure, why not, whatever. Remember that this is not a development schedule, so this is really more about creating something that's visually indicative and less about the specifics of dates. So bath system design, that's a large, what's a large, 3 months? Okay, 3 months. Same for capybara character lineup. Bath levels is a medium, which I put at 1.5 months with the team. Drag that down. And then the weekly challenge game mode, that's another large. All right. So now we have all of our blocks of work represented. The next thing you want to think about is arranging those blocks so that they represent the way the team is conceptualizing when work will happen. So an easy way to think about this is push and pull factors. So for example, if I pop some disciplines on here, so let's say QA is going to be doing most of our App Store submission work. Again, this is a very small team where people are sharing roles. Bath system design is happening by a designer. Let's say that the character lineup is mostly art, the levels is mostly art, and the challenge game mode is mostly design. So just bear with me for oversimplifying some of these things. So I know that QA, a lot of their work is at the end of our pipeline, and I know that they're going to be working all the way up to submission. So that's my push factor. It's pushing along the timescale down to the end of our schedule. Bath system design, look, I know that this was our second highest priority. I know I've got one designer, so they're going to be working on it first. So that is a pull factor. It's being pulled towards the left of my timescale. Similar for Capybara character lineup and the bath levels. There are no push and pull factors on that. Weekly challenge game mode, I know that there's a dependency between these two. So that's a push factor for the game mode. So that can only start after this has been done. All right, so now we have our time constraints, we have the work that needs to be done, we have our t-shirt sizes represented, and we've looked at our push and pull factors in terms of when this work might happen. And now we want to look at our risk severity ratings. So we said number 5 for App Store submission preparation. So all I'm going to do is make it red, something I love to do. Then we've got 2 number 4s for character lineup and levels. So that's these 2. I'm going to make it red, and I'm just going to reduce the opacity a bit to show it's not as severe as that one. And then weekly challenge game mode, it's a 1. So I'm going to make that red. I'm going to turn that opacity down even further. Okay, so now we have all of the information that we're aware of about our project, this phase, the work that needs to be done, and the way the team feels about that work. Now that is all visualized on our roadmap. So now we can see if there are any obvious changes that we might want to make. So for example, I know that we only have one artist. We called that out in our risk assessment, but I can see I've got 2 big chunks of work that need to be done at the same time. So, all right, if I've only got one artist, I'm going to move that along. I just realized I missed a bit, so I'm going to go back. We don't have all of the information because we don't have the constraints on the hiring constraints. All right, so the last thing that we have over here in our budget is that we're currently a team of 3 and we can only hire 2 more full-time people. We have 2 people we want to hire, but they're only available from specific dates. So we've got 2 designers I want to bring onto the team. I feel like we need to bring these 2 designers on because I know there's a lot of systems work and values tweaking and finessing that's going to need to happen once we're in that user acquisition mode. I feel like it's important that we add 2 designers to the project. So in order to represent this, I'm going to add an extra layer to the roadmap. So I'm going to pull this in. So this is just a scale that's representative of the full-time team members. So right now we're at a 3, and I know that we're going to be at a 5. Given that along the top, we have our time scale, what I'm going to do is bring in this line, which is going to overlay how many people are on the team at any point in time. The reason that I might add information like this, and for your project, it might not be about hiring, it could be about playtesting frequency, it could be about when stakeholder reviews are going to happen, is because this is a really impactful metric on the discussions of the risk of the project. And so having it visualized with all the other information helps me make clearer decisions about what I'm doing. Okay, now we have all of our information on our roadmap. So we want to look at if there's anything obvious that we might change about this plan before we get into the nitty-gritty, because sometimes you'd be surprised that there's just a very glaring mistake or something you just haven't talked about or an assumption that's been made that you can very quickly fix. So for example, I know I only have one artist and I've got 2 blocks of artwork happening at the same time. So what happens if I move this along? Well, I know there's a dependency between these 2 pieces of work. So does that mean that this piece of work is now at risk and cannot be done in time? What does that mean? So I have some questions around that. And now we get to move into my absolute favorite part of risk road mapping. So if you've tuned out or if you're a little bit lost, come back to me. This is the part that you really need to pay attention to. This is my favorite part, which is where we get to scribble all over our roadmap. So, get your big red marker if you're doing this on a whiteboard. And we're going to look at the clusters of risk. So for example, there's a cluster here. I have a lot of artwork to be done and not enough artists, it seems like. There's a cluster here because I've got a major piece of work that, on the most ambitious of timelines is not going to be done in time for QA to test it for this submission preparation. And I'm going to call out a question mark here. So I've got this BART systems design, which other than App Store submission is the most important thing that we're doing in this phase. And yet my 2 extra designers are also coming on at the same time that work is being done by 1 designer. So what happens when we're training those people? What happens when we're onboarding those people is a big question mark for me. And then the other thing is obviously this dependency, which is no longer making sense. If we're giving art 1 stream of work to focus on, then this is a problem. So once you've identified kind of your clusters of risk and you've circled them, scribbled them, however you want to do it, we want to document those risks as how might we statements. So if you've never used a how might we statement before, this is just a way to reframe a problem or a challenge as something that has a variety of solutions. So I quickly pre-wrote some before this talk that would cover this. So for example, instead of saying QA does not have enough time to test this weekly challenge game mode, I might say, how might we get QA what they need in order in time for submission? For example, we might say, how might we get design what they need from art to start the game mode work sooner? I might say, how might we distribute work more evenly across our team in this phase where we're onboarding 2 designers at the same time as art is overloaded, QA is overloaded? And also, how might we manage our art workload in this period where we obviously need more art to be happening than is feasible right now? And that's really a first pass of a risk roadmap. You've got your work that needs to be done, the way the team feels about it. You've assessed if there are any quick changes you can make. You've identified what those core risks are. You've documented those risks as how might we statements. And the next step is to have this discussion with your team. So what might come out of that is something like this. And every business and every project is going to have slightly different kind of categories of risks, but I've kept it very simple for today. I've got resources, scope, and schedule. So after having these discussions with the team, you might write more detailed how might we statements. For example, adding 2 designers with minimal work for them in this phase may overload the lead designer with onboarding and training. How might we allow the lead designer to focus on the critical path for this milestone? And after discussing it with the team, it might be, actually we have this other problem space, which is it doesn't seem like 1 artist can finish the required work in time for design to iterate on game mode. So how can we get art to design earlier? Well, these actually have the same mitigation. So let's change our hiring plan. Let's look at bringing on 1 artist and 1 designer. And now I hear QA people saying, why not bring on another QA person? In this convenient hypothetical scenario, QA's practices will not scale to adding another person that close to submission, but having design work done earlier will help them more. So the mitigation for this might be reduce the scope of the challenge game mode and start work with placeholder art sooner, and so on. You can imagine how that process would evolve as you discuss the details of these problem spaces even more. But the most important step, into my mind, of this kind of risk and mitigation pass that you do with your team after you've created your risk roadmap is to time box your mitigations. So I'm giving us a month to look at finding a new artist, a week to reduce the scope and define grey box requirement, 2 weeks to reach out to our friends in the industry about App Store submission processes and see if we're on the right track for this, given that it is our biggest risk on the roadmap. And then after looking at those time boxes, okay, when are we going to meet again? When are we going to have this conversation? And we're going to say, okay, 2 weeks from now, let's do this again. And because you're keeping it so lightweight, you're not requiring a huge amount of legwork beforehand. It is something that you can do in an afternoon, have a quick 45-minute meeting, figure out your next step of risks and mitigations. Okay, so in summary, this is a very simplified example. I've done this process for very large, complex projects with multiple feature teams and external partners before, and it has worked out for me. So don't be fooled by the simplicity of the example. Your team has a lot of insights into how to manage your production better. It's very easy as a production person or someone in a leadership position to try and protect them from this process. But the more that you engage with the team and let them validate your plan, let them ask questions, identify what those problem spaces are, come up with mitigations together, share the load of that, you're going to find that you're really getting the best out of the expertise that you have. And visualizing that information, prioritizing it and doing it early and often will give everyone more time to focus on their work and on mitigation strategy. And you don't need to be a producer or have any special training or tools to do this. It can be as simple as we did today. It can be way more detailed. You can integrate Jira with this. You can get way more fancy, but it really doesn't have to be any more complicated than post-it notes, markers on a whiteboard. So I also have this slide for you at the end. If you enjoyed this, you can subscribe to a newsletter that I write for free on the internet at workinglunch.substack.com, where we cover this kind of content, production, creative leadership content. And I hope that if you enjoyed this talk, you would also enjoy the newsletter. You can also screenshot this slide, which has all of the steps to creating a very basic risk roadmap, maybe something that's helpful for you in future. So I will give you a couple seconds to screenshot that. And then now we will leave about 5 minutes for questions and answers in the chat. Thank you.